Chapter 1. The Perfumed Letter That Came Like a Whisper. If ever a man could be said to arrive with the precision of a metronome, it was Hercule Poirot. I, Captain Arthur Hastings, had been invited, along with half the county it seemed, to the evening salon at the Langley estate, a glittering cluster of candlelight and murmured compliments in the stiff heart of Mayfair. The hostess, Lady Penelope Langley, was famed for her soirees, which combined the refinement of old money with just enough scandal to keep the notices attentive. That night, the rooms shimmered with silk, diamonds, and that curious tension one feels when something unspoken hangs like a mist over the conversation. I'd been chatting, or rather attempting to keep pace with, a lively discussion on the merits of foreign automobiles when the murmur of the salon was cut, subtly at first, by a sound almost as delicate as the break of a porcelain cup. No one noticed it consciously, for it was a thing that sank like a pebble thrown into a still pond. The ripples came afterward. Lady Penelope, radiant in emerald and pearls, had retired for a moment to the inner salon, ostensibly to fetch an extra decanter of sherry. There, on the low table beside her embroidered chaise, lay a letter. It was no ordinary letter. The paper was of the sort one associates with private confidences, cream, heavy, and soft to the touch. A faint trace of delicate perfume trailed from its folds, a scent not overpowering but insinuating, something between jasmine and something more exotic that gave one the sense of being drawn into a secret. The seal was broken, and the topmost line of writing had been folded back as though the writer had hesitated, then yielded. It was the arrival of this letter that began the affair, though we were not to know how deeply the little grey cells of Monsieur Poirot would be engaged by it. Lady Penelope's maid, a prim young woman with eyes that flicked like wary birds, had found her ladyship collapsed against the cushions, her hand over her bosom, the expression on her face a strange mixture of astonishment and agony. The room emptied with a sudden, mechanical movement. Conversations were abandoned mid-laugh, and the orchestra, somewhere beyond the gilded doors, fell into an awkward silence. I was among those who rushed in. Lady Penelope lay with her head slightly turned, her lips parted, and, very faintly, the scent of that peculiar perfume was about her. There was no visible wound, no blood, no sign of violent struggle. Her dress remained immaculate. Her eyes, when I bent to look, were open and fixed. They held, beneath their glazed surface, a look as if some truth had been seen and would not be conceded to silence. "She has been poisoned," murmured Lord Granville, who had authority and an instinctive belief that any crisis required immediate diagnosis. "It might be sudden collapse, a heart," I ventured, for I am not, as you know, a great student of medicine. "It is not that," said Poirot, in that soft voice of his which always compelled one to pay attention, even when one did not know why. He stood just inside the doorway, his small moustache bristling with the faintest expression of concern and alertness combined. He had been present, of course. How could he refuse such an evening? But until that moment I had not noticed the degree to which his dark eyes were scanning the room with mathematical swiftness. He did not push forward, he simply observed, like a spider watching the trembling of its web. The maid had, without being asked, handed the letter to a butler who held it like a minor relic. Poirot glanced at it once. There was a slight lift of his eyebrow, a contraction of some interior muscle. He did not touch it further. "Who wrote it?" he asked quietly. "No signature," the butler replied. "It was on the table when Lady Penelope returned. The seal had been broken. There is something peculiar, Monsieur Poirot." He looked to me as if seeking explanation that I lacked. I bent, too, to look at the note. The first line, which had been exposed, bore only a phrase in a delicate, sloping hand. "Some truths are like perfume. Too much overwhelms. The right breath reveals." Beneath that, the paper had been folded as if the writer had stopped, reconsidered, and then decided against continuing in full. A single drop of something, dried and faint, sat near the lower edge. Poirot did not seem to see it as a clue to hastily announce. Rather, it was as if he had received a small private footnote in a complicated equation. "There is fragrance here," he said almost to himself, and turned that way, his eyes briefly catching on the assembled guests who had drawn in a tight ring. "But not the sort one expects from an evening of roses and lilies. This is a perfume that has traveled. I ask that no one leave the room. We shall have the doctor." Lady Penelope, of course, had no enemies who would speak outright in a gathering such as this. She was beloved, or at least tolerated, by all the right people. Yet among them, I noted, with a strained smile of her cousin, Miss Charlotte Wentworth, the restless, almost feverish glance of her recent business associate, Mr. Alistair Crane, and a gentleman from the continent, Count Vasilev, whose diplomatic manner hid something that moved under the skin like a restless fish. There was also Sir Edmund Harlow, whose interest in Lady Penelope's philanthropic endeavours had become the subject of subtle society whispers. Each of them now stood like one of those theatrical statues waiting for the curtain to fall. Poirot moved with quiet elegance to the chaise. He placed his gloved fingertips near the letter without touching it and held them there for a breath. Then, with perfect courtesy, he turned to me. "Hastings," he said, "there are, n'est-ce pas, smells that tell stories, if one knows how to listen." I confess I had not yet learned the entire vocabulary of those stories. I only knew that the room had changed, the laughter had gone with Lady Penelope's breath, and in its place was a pressure. An unspoken question. Who had dared to send a whisper like that, and what was the meaning of a perfumed letter that arrived like a secret, only to be left unfinished? The doctor came, with a quiet, professional manner. He examined Lady Penelope's hands, her pulse, her eyes. He shook his head slightly. "She is dead," he said with the dispassionate tone of a man delivering a verdict. "No marks to indicate a struggle. Poison, perhaps. Something inhaled. There are traces of an aroma." He stopped, for a moment, uncertain perhaps whether to name it. Poirot, silently, had already noted. I looked at the letter again. The phrase had a sort of gravity, as if to say that what had happened was not merely an act of violence, but the opening of a puzzle, one which required the dissecting of appearances, the catching of scents, and, above all, the understanding of people who thought themselves cleverer than they were. Poirot turned, and the little grey cells behind his calm eyes began to whirl like the cogs of a finely tuned machine. Chapter 2. The first threads of contradiction, the room, once a place of elegant conviviality, had become a theatre of suspended breaths. Servants moved like nervous shadows. The body of Lady Penelope Langley had been carried with discreet solemnity to a small adjoining chamber. The guests remained, as Poirot had requested, clustered in that wide salon, their voices reduced to murmurs that skimmed the surface without daring to plunge. It was in that quiet aftermath that the first real examination of the scene began, not with a flourish, but with the delicate, probing touch of a mind that did not rush for scandal, but for detail. Poirot, having politely deferred to the doctor's initial pronouncement, now stood with his small, exact fingers clasped, eyes shifting from one face to another as if measuring their internal angles. He did not begin with accusations. Instead, he requested the butler produce a delicate glass bowl, a small card, and, with gentle insistence, that Miss Charlotte Wentworth, Lady Penelope's cousin, allow him to gesture without seeming to pry. "Very well," Poirot said, stepping with that quiet imperiousness which paradoxically compelled obedience more than command. "We shall begin not with the greatest, but with the smallest of things. The letter." The note lay again where it had been placed, now in a protective envelope, attended by the butler like a fragile relic. Poirot took it in his hand, and for the first time, with that little theatrical grace that made one think of a man unwrapping a secret present, he opened the remaining folds. He did not unfold everything at once. He paused, as if listening to the whisper of the paper itself. "There," he said, pointing. "See the crease? Not random." The writer stopped, then started again. He turned slightly toward me. "Hastings, you see, n'est-ce pas? There is hesitation. One who wishes to speak but fears, or one who wishes to mislead and leaves a trail for the clever to follow." Miss Wentworth, whose calm face had until now been composed like a statue's, colored faintly. Lady Penelope was expecting something, she ventured. "She was expecting nothing, mademoiselle," Poirot replied in his mild, inexorable way. "Yet she received the scent." He inhaled softly, not theatrically, just enough to draw the faint fragrance again to his awareness, as if committing it to the ledger of senses. "Très curieux. Not an ordinary perfume one would wear to a public gathering. This has traveled from somewhere private. It is, perhaps, a message disguised as a scent." "Could it be a threat?" asked Mr. Alistair Crane, his voice carrying a dry tone that attempted to hide the tremor beneath. "It could be many things," Poirot mused. "But the important question is, from whom, and to whom was it meant to speak? The letter was placed where Lady Penelope would surely see it. That means the writer wished her to know, or wished others to believe she had seen it. But why leave it unfinished? Why that drop?" He lifted his finger toward the spot near the edge, where the dried trace glimmered like an old secret. "Which is not a blemish of mere accident. It is the residue of something liquid, perhaps an incense, perhaps a substance used to underline. We must not leap, we observe." "Your language, Monsieur Poirot," I said, "makes it sound as if the letter itself has spoken to you." "It does," he answered with a small smile. "And I listen. You will see, Hastings, that the letter is the faintest drumbeat. The music will follow." He turned to the assembled group. "I should like now to ask each of you one small thing. Where were you when you first became aware that Lady Penelope had the letter? And," he added gently, "did any of you see anyone approach her inner salon in the last quarter hour?" Count Vasilev stepped forward first, his continental ease slightly fractured by a careful composure. "I was conversing with Sir Edmund about a charity concert. I saw nothing unusual near Lady Penelope's room. I confess I heard a soft sound, perhaps a drawer closing, but the estate is full of small noises." Sir Edmund Harlow, who had been standing with his hands behind his back, exhaled slowly. "I was with Miss Wentworth near the bay window. Lady Penelope had sent for more sherry, and we talked of her new philanthropic campaign. I observed no one. I only heard that small noise too, like the tick of a clock misbehaving." Miss Wentworth, with an almost imperceptible tightening of her mouth, replied, "I was with Sir Edmund. I walked her part way herself." She paused, as she often did, near the painting of her late mother. When she left to fetch the sherry, I returned to the group. "I did not go into her inner salon." Mr. Crane's dark eyes flicked toward the corridor. "I was with Lady Penelope earlier, discussing a proposed business alliance. I left to speak with Lord Granville about the estate's finances. I noticed no one near her inner salon." Poirot's gaze settled briefly on a young footman who had been hovering at the edge of the gathering with a pale eagerness that suggested obedience more than curiosity. "And you? You were in the hall, oui? You brought the sherry?" "No?" The boy nodded, nervous. "Yes, monsieur. I heard the sound and went to announce to the maid that she might wish to—" "She found her lady collapsed," Poirot finished simply. "Très bien. You did your duty." Poirot then asked that the note be placed near the bowl of water and a small scrap of velvet from the chaise be brought. He had the maid open the window a fraction, not to let in air, but so that the scent would not stagnate and mix with others, confusing the matter. Then he drew Lady Penelope's dressing screen slightly aside, revealing a faint smear on the inner edge, one that, at first glance, would have passed as the result of idle use. "See here," Poirot said, pointing, "a shadow of another hand. It is subtle, a mark perhaps from someone who had touched and then withdrawn with care, because she did not wish the impression to be deep. This hand, however, is not the same as the one that placed the letter. There is tension in the fingers. Someone perhaps nervous, or someone hiding a secret. Do you mean someone entered her room after she received the letter?" Lord Granville asked, voice growing thick with concern. "But why would they leave no trace?" "Because the clever do not always leave what the clumsy do," Poirot replied. "We are collecting small contradictions. They will form the outline of a truth." He looked toward me, and the expression behind his calm face held that anticipation which says a puzzle has begun to show its pattern. "Hastings," he murmured, "the first thread has unrolled. We must wait, but we must watch. There is someone among these people who has been too careful by being careless. That, mon ami, is always suspicious." So it began, not with accusation, but with the gathering of those quiet, uneasy particulars that announce a war of wits. The letter, the faint mark, the strange smiles, the small shared sound that could mean nothing, or everything, were the first threads Poirot would weave into the tapestry of what had happened. Chapter 3. Faces in the drawing-room, the Langley salon, which had moments before been a place of polite laughter, now had the taut, uneasy hush of a room where every glance was measured. Poirot, having set the first delicate threads in motion, turned his attention to the people themselves, each a small study in contradictions, secrets wrapped in courteous speech. It was time, as he often said, to know the heart behind the mask. He began with those nearest to Lady Penelope, not in rank, but in intimacy of manner. Miss Charlotte Wentworth, her cousin, was a woman of about 30 with an air of cultivated reserve. Her education had been continental. She spoke 4 languages with ease, and her accent, in English, carried soft vowels that made even small grievances seem genteel. Yet beneath her composed surface there was a tightness in the corners of her eyes when she spoke of Lady Penelope's recent decisions. Charlotte had been left the guardian of certain charitable funds, which Lady Penelope had lately suggested might be redirected, an idea that, in polite society, had been received with cautious silence. There was something like defiance bottled behind her calm, a loyalty that might be love, or something that had been betrayed. Mr. Alistair Crane was harder to read. Younger than most in the room, with the lean, alert look of a man who had once been a soldier and now traded in whispers of investments, his presence at the Langley estate was explained by a mutually beneficial partnership with Lady Penelope. He was charming, affable, and possessed of a certain restless energy. His hands, however, betrayed something else, fingers that tapped lightly when he spoke, as if impatient with time itself. He had been pushing for a lucrative extension of his schemes, and the letter's arrival, coupled with the death, could very well interrupt those plans unless they were, in some fashion, redirected to his advantage. Count Vasilev presented the image of the cosmopolitan aristocrat who had seen too much of the world to be surprised by anything. Tall, dark-haired, with a manner that slid easily between warmth and distance, he wore the countenance of a man whose loyalties had been practiced like a performance. He claimed to have charitable interests in England, to be here for cultural exchange, and yet his eyes, when not observing others, flicked toward the eastern end of the room as if aware of something beyond the present. He had been seen speaking in quiet tones with Lady Penelope at earlier functions about a proposed gallery in which her name would be memorialized. The question was whether the memorial was a gesture of gratitude or a procurement of silence. Sir Edmund Harlow, with his broad shoulders and philanthropic laurels, had always enjoyed being seen as a man of benevolence. He was sincere in public declarations, at least, and his philanthropy had done real good. But of late, The gossip had whisperingly attached another dimension to his interest in Lady Penelope. His funding of a particular hospital wing had been dependent on certain privileges Lady Penelope had begun to reassess. He smiled easily, with a practiced charm. But there was a flicker when Poirot's gaze lingered that suggested his outward generosity may have had a more urgent interior pulse, a need to secure legacy, status, or perhaps to hide a failing foundation's insolvency. Lord Granville, whose estate in the north had long been in friendly correspondence with Lady Penelope's family, stood quiet, a figure like a carved oak. His loyalty was the sort that had been tested over generations. He was the one who had encouraged the union of several social alliances through careful marriages and the subtle dispensing of favors. He had been one of the first to speak of the idea that the letter was a warning, and yet when Poirot had gently questioned him, his voice betrayed not uncertainty but a cultivated worry. Worry for the reputation of the Langley name now entangled with scandal. There were others. Mrs. Evelyn Harcourt, an old school friend of Lady Penelope's, had arrived late, flushed with the stress of travel. She carried herself with cultivated ease, and her chatter was a veneer over a deeper anxiety. She had been the one to ask pointed questions about Lady Penelope's recent will changes. She had an interest, not of blood, but of long-standing emotional attachment, tied up in pieces of an inheritance that had been spoken of in quiet parlors for months. The term old promises had been used, with that melancholy note which often tends to strain the line between affection and expectation. And then there was the small, quiet member of the gathering who might have been overlooked by all but Poirot. Miss Lydia Penn, the young secretary recently hired to assist Lady Penelope in her burgeoning philanthropic paperwork. She was barely 25, with earnest eyes and a soft voice that seldom rose above a whisper. She had been recommended, Poirot learned, by a friend of a friend, and she had come with a bright hope of serving a cause she believed in. Yet in the recent weeks, her hands had trembled over ledgers where sums were being shifted in ways that made her uncomfortable. Her loyalty was not yet hardened into confidence. She had seen things she did not understand fully, and that lack of comprehension weighed on her like a guilty secret, though she had none to confess. As each was introduced more fully in the parlor's slow, deliberate way, Poirot made small notations, not on paper, but in the subtle movement of his features. A raised eyebrow, a softness in tone when addressing one, a deliberate pause with another. He asked for recollections not to catch them out, but to hear the spaces between words. He knit their versions together, comparing sequence to the almost negligible sound they had all noticed, the faint mark in the dressing screen, the way the letter had been poised like a question. "What? Mon ami," he murmured to me at one point, as if the others were not within earshot, though they were. "Do you observe? Miss Wentworth's loyalty. Is it of blood or is it of debt? Mr. Crane's impatience. Does it come from ambition or fear? The others, they are polite, yes, but the politeness of people who have something to preserve is different from those whose politeness is simply habit." I could see, in the shifting angles of their faces and the small betrayals of manner, that each was beginning to take the measure of the others as well. The drawing-room had become an arena where alliances might be tested and revealed, if only subtly. No one knew yet which small contradiction would become the fulcrum. Poirot concluded the introductions not with a declaration, but with a quiet pronouncement. "We are all, mes amis, like guests at a theatre performance where the final act has not yet been decided. The curtain trembles. We must wait, but the waiting is not idle. Observe, listen. The smallest thing will speak." So, with the suspects delineated in careful strokes, no grand accusation yet, only the contours of motives, the soft shadows of envy, obligation, desire, and fear, the net was being woven. The salon hummed again, not with previous gaiety, but with the electric, patient silence of minds beginning to suspect that the true performance had only just begun. Chapter 4. Monsieur Poirot takes measure. It would have been easy in such a crisis for the local authorities to seize upon the obvious, the letter, the perfume, the sudden death, and offer a tidy explanation, one that assuaged public shock and placed blame in a simple, comfortable box. Fortunately, or perhaps inevitably, Hercule Poirot was not content with comfort. He had, until that moment, been an observer in the periphery, his presence like a careful undercurrent beneath the surface chatter. Now he stepped fully into the light, not with fanfare, but with that particular reserve that made those around him feel as if a magnifying glass had been set upon them, not to scorch, but to illuminate. He turned slowly, deliberately, to face the entire room. There was in his posture something of a quiet declaration that the evening had now shifted from a social gathering to a field of inquiry. "My friends," he said, in that soft, measured voice which, paradoxically, made even the most ordinary phrase feel as if it contained a weighty promise. "We are in the presence of a very singular thing. Lady Penelope Langley has died. It is not, perhaps, as one would wish. Simple, clear, without shadow. There is a veil of something placed between what is seen and what is true. It is the little grey cells that must lift it, n'est-ce pas?" He turned to Lord Granville with a polite inclination of the head. "You suggested that the letter might be a warning. That is a possibility, yet one must wonder, for whom was the warning intended? To speak to Lady Penelope only, or to us all through her?" Lord Granville stiffened slightly. "The letter was intended for her, Monsieur Poirot. She would have known, or at least suspected, something was amiss. I only wished to protect the family name." "And yet," Poirot replied, "protection sometimes requires knowing the danger. You see, the protection is less in denial than in understanding. We must not allow reputation to block the path to truth. It is truth that ultimately preserves reputation, non?" He turned then, and his gaze slid like an invisible thread across each face, collecting, storing, weighing. The others, who had each, until now, been operating from their own assumptions, privilege, obligation, self-preservation, felt the atmosphere change. Poirot did not speak accusatorily. That was not his way. He spoke with the calm of a surgeon laying out instruments before making an incision. "I've been asked," he continued, "to offer my assistance. It is not to say that the official authority is lacking, but that the official theory, simple as it may be, is perhaps incomplete." He inclined his head toward the doctor. "Doctor, you have observed that Lady Penelope's death is sudden, without visible wound. Poison is suspected. That is already a beginning. But one does not end with suspicion. One follows the thread." Miss Lydia Penn, who had lingered near the far side of the room, her hands clasped, looked up, her eyes reflecting both a nervousness and a dawning relief that someone was beginning to ask the right questions. Poirot had not yet spoken to her directly, but his glance had touched her in a way that let her know she was not invisible. "I shall ask one thing of all present," Poirot said. "Do not leave this room without first speaking with me. That, too, is not to restrain you, but to gather. If you have seen or heard anything that seems, how does one say, unimportant, mention it. The unimportant is the most important, for it is the gap between truths where deception hides." Miss Charlotte Wentworth, with her slim fingers pressed lightly together, inclined her head. "You think, Monsieur Poirot, that there has been deliberate placement of misdirection?" "There is always, mademoiselle," Poirot replied, "some intention behind action. That does not mean all intention is malicious. Sometimes it is protective, sometimes it is fearful. We shall see." He then asked that everyone be seated, not for comfort, but so that words would be spoken with less movement, more care. He sent, with a brief whispered instruction, for the local inspector to bring his notebook and for the maid to retrieve Lady Penelope's personal items. her fan, a compact, and a small private diary that, according to the maid, had recently been kept close and locked. The presence of that diary, though unspoken yet, held the weight of a personal world. And Poirot's eyes flickered when he heard of it. He did not ask for it immediately. He had learned over years that forcing a hand could make the hand close tighter. Patience, coupled with precise pressure, was his true art. "You have all told me where you were when you became aware," Poirot said, "but I should like now to know, was there anyone whom you felt, in that last hour before the letter was discovered, to be strangely quiet? Not the loudness of guilt, but a silence which is heavy. Look, mes amis, not for what is obvious. We already have the obvious. I want the flavor of hesitation." There was a stillness, a slight stirring of breath. A few responded cautiously, Count Vasilev saying he had seen Mr. Crane step away from Lady Penelope's side for a brief moment. Mr. Crane, in turn, mentioning the slight appearance of Sir Edmund glancing toward the inner salon, and then quickly shifting his gaze away. These were small observations, innocuous in appearance. Yet when offered into the pool of what Poirot was collecting, they shimmered like tiny fish beneath the surface, visible if one knew how to look. Poirot turned to me. "Hastings, you observe, there is a natural tendency in these gatherings to assume the most dramatic explanation. The truth is often the one wearing the regular face, looking as if it belongs." "And the letter," I ventured. "It seems to be an invitation to think, rather than accuse." "Exactement. It opens the door and then pauses, like someone who knocks softly to see if someone listens. The fragrance was the hand extended. The omission was the question left hanging. I shall keep that question in my pocket until the answer unfolds." He paused, his eyes sweeping the room once more. In that brief silence, the others understood that the evening had shifted. No longer was this merely a tragedy to be whispered about. It had become a puzzle, one in which each of them, willingly or not, played a part, actor, witness, possible deceiver. Poirot did not yet pronounce the official theory wrong outright. He allowed the blank space to swell, for in that swelling the true form of the case would reveal itself, not by force, but by the gentle pulling of threads. He had arrived fully now, not as a guest, but as the orchestrator of the inquiry to come. Chapter 5. Initial Interviews. Begin the drawing-room, now stripped of its earlier levity, became a quiet theatre of subtle probing. Poirot, having set the tone with measured gravity, began the first round of interviews, not as blunt interrogations, but as conversations that invited confession while revealing contradiction in the spaces between answers. He had the inspector relieve the immediate tension by taking notes, and he sent the maid away with careful instructions. Nothing was to be touched further in Lady Penelope's private room until he said so. He motioned first to Miss Charlotte Wentworth. She sat with her back straight, fingers lightly intertwined, projecting that cultivated composure which, in another context, might have been mistaken for serenity. Poirot placed before her a small card, merely a convenience, a resting place for a hand, and leaned slightly forward. "Mademoiselle," he began, "you are a woman who has served in many circles. You know the weight of responsibility. Lady Penelope was, no? A friend and cousin. Tell me, when the question of the redirection of funds was first spoken, what, precisely, was your reaction?" Charlotte's lips pressed together. "I questioned the prudence, Monsieur Poirot. I spoke privately with her, suggesting that such changes might alarm those who depended on the previous arrangements. She listened, but she did not yield. She said the world had changed, and charity must change with it." "And did you believe," Poirot asked gently, "that this change would be accepted readily by those who had been promised stability?" "I believed she was right to pressure for honesty," she replied, her voice cool, but there was a flicker, just a flicker, of something like wounded pride. "Perhaps I underestimated how much people preferred the known lie to the uncertain truth. Ah, Poirot murmured, and his little grey cells turned. You note that preferences can be a shackle. You did not, however, attempt to stop her by force. That would not be your style, but you watched. Very good. Then it was Mr. Alistair Crane's turn. He lounged slightly, appearing casual, but his fingers, as ever, betrayed him, drumming an erratic rhythm on the arm of the chair. You have been very busy, no? Poirot said. Business, proposals, plans, and yet you made time to speak privately with Lady Penelope. She was interested in backing a new venture. Crane said smoothly, I merely offered the expertise. If her death interrupts progress, it is regrettable, but the venture will proceed, with or without her. Regrettable. Yet, Poirot leaned in, eyes brightening slightly. When you stepped away from her side before the letter was discovered, you looked toward the inner salon, did you not? A small hesitation. Did you feel, what is the word, excluded from something? Crane's smile did not falter, but his jaw clamped for a heartbeat. I noticed nothing unusual. I was thinking of figures. The scent in the room has made many think of trifles. Trifles are the bones on which the truth rests, Poirot replied easily. We shall keep the thinking of figures in mind. Count Vasilev, with his practiced ease, received Poirot's inquiry like a man who had been asked about the weather, simple in appearance, layered beneath. You are to be part of a gallery proposal, Poirot said. A memorial, maybe, to honor Lady Penelope, no? Honor is a word that hides many shades, the Count replied. I wish to create something lasting. She spoke of legacy. I spoke of light. The letter... He paused. It is a curious thing, no? Perfume and a fragment of half-sentence. One might consider it art. Art that finishes? Poirot asked. Or art that stops where the hand trembled? It is better, sometimes, to leave things unfinished, the Count answered, not uncandid, yet not entirely revealing. Sir Edmund Harlow, whose philanthropic endeavours seemed to have softened him to many, sat back, palms visible. You had been seeking certain privileges, Sir Edmund, Poirot observed. Privileges that Lady Penelope was reconsidering. How did you feel when she did not offer the same assurance as before? Sir Edmund gave a small, practised sigh. The world shifts, Monsieur Poirot. One must adapt. I did not feel uneasy, only surprised. I had felt that our plans were in alignment. Her change was abrupt. Surprise often precedes a search for cause, Poirot said. Did you speak to her after the change, to clarify? Or did you accept silence? I asked, Sir Edmund said. She gave no promise. She suggested we revisit the matter later. And later, Poirot said softly, came too late. He made sure, between each conversation, to allow the smallest pause so that the others in the room could feel, if not the content, then the effect that their own stories were being weighed. He did not yet bring up Lydia Penn directly, though he glanced in her direction and saw how she had drawn inward, like someone shielding a small, fragile thing. He did, however, ask to speak with Mrs. Evelyn Harcourt. Mrs. Harcourt's voice carried that tone of old intimacy, now shaded with the gravity of loss. Promises, she said when prompted about the will murmurs, are too often spoken as if they are eternal when they are fragile. Lady Penelope and I had spoken. She was changing what was to come. She asked me if I would understand. I told her I would. She did not ask me to wait. Would you have preferred she had not changed it? Poirot asked. I would have preferred that she had told me the whole, she replied. I do not blame her for the change. I am sorry she is gone. Subtle, but there. Remorse, not for cause, but for being left outside the full circle of trust. Poirot concluded the first cycle by asking Lord Granville about the sentiment of the room, whether he had sensed anything that deviated from normal societal rhythm. Lord Granville, steadfast and reserved, admitted a tension, a slight avoidance of direct questions when Lady Penelope began speaking of changes. "People listen differently when the future is in question," he said. When the interviews had paused, Poirot turned to me. "You see, Hastings, how each explanation hides a little hesitation. It is not in what they defend, but what they leave hanging. The letter has given us nothing explicit, no names, no threats, but it has stirred currents. We are beginning to see eddies. The great flow will become obvious if we continue to watch carefully." He folded his hands and, with a slight smile, added, "Patience, mon ami. The others think their stories are complete. They do not yet see that the questioning has just begun." Chapter 6. The First False Lead. The day began outwardly, with the polite movements of a household attempting to steady itself. Tea was brought in with silent precision. Flowers were replaced. Conversation remained cautious, held at arm's length from the dark core that had settled at the heart of the Langley estate. And yet, beneath that veneer, something had shifted in its direction. The threads of inquiry, once still, now quivered as if a hand had brushed across them. It was in the midst of this shifting that the first, apparently clear, conclusion presented itself. Inspector Mallory, a solid, earnest man with method and a sense of duty sharpened by years of practice, had been working quietly, obedient to Poirot's subtle requests. He had, in the morning, been permitted to examine Lady Penelope's private study, an area previously off-limits until proper procedure was observed. There, in a small drawer of Miss Charlotte Wentworth's writing bureau, a scrap of paper had been found. It contained a fragment of handwriting, and a phrase identical in style to the line on the perfumed letter, "Some truths are like perfume." The loops of the cursive, the particular way the tail of the P curled, had been noted by the inspector as too similar to discount. Beneath that, in a different ink and haste, were two words: "Change, now." Moreover, a maid, new to the household and breathless with guilt, had come forward. She claimed to have seen Miss Wentworth leave Lady Penelope's inner salon shortly before the discovery of the letter, carrying a small sachet of perfume in her hand. The implication, spoken in hushed urgency to the inspector, was that Miss Wentworth had been involved not only in the giving of the note, but in some intimate alteration of the scene, a confrontation perhaps, and a motive to silence Lady Penelope before some secret could be exposed. Word travelled fast. The drawing-room, which had been the domain of cautious whispers, filled with a low murmur. Eyes flickered toward Charlotte with newly sharpened interest. Her earlier composure had a slight crack. She, for her part, had been summoned. When she entered, the air felt cooler, as if expectation itself had chilled it. Poirot, having been informed, did not show surprise. He had, of course, expected movement. He did not, however, allow the growing weight of the assembled impressions to bend him toward a hasty conclusion. He asked for the scrap and the maid's statement to be read aloud in the smaller, intimate parlour, with only the principal parties present. The scrap was placed between them, magnified in importance by the way the inspector handled it, carefully, with the air of one presenting evidence. Miss Wentworth listened without flinching, though I could see the tension at the base of her throat. When she spoke, her voice was controlled, but there was an edge in it, sharpened, perhaps, by the slightest wound of accusation. "It is true," she said. "I went to see Lady Penelope. I wished to discuss the way she was diverting funds. I carried nothing with me but my notes. I had not expected to see her with the letter. I left because she was, how shall I say, distracted. As for the scrap," she held her hands calmly, "that is my handwriting, yes. I have been copying passages from a book on epistolary phrasing. I jotted the phrase earlier because it struck me as apt, and I admit I had been meditating on how one conveys difficult truths. I had no intention to threaten her. The sachet the girl saw was mine, an old perfume she had once given me, which I carried out of habit. The girl is new. She may have misread what she saw." Inspector Mallory, who had already been feeling the satisfaction of a tangible lead, leaned forward. "You were seen, Miss Wentworth, leaving her room with that sachet. The phrasing on the scrap mirrors the letter, and you had recent argument about the changes to the funds. It is consistent, non?" "It is consistent only if one constructs a straight line from scattered points," Poirot said softly. "Miss Wentworth's handwriting is indeed similar. People who write much develop a personal rhythm. The perfume was old, and she carries it as a charm. The girl believes she saw something. Memory is a fragile thing. But," he turned then, just enough to let the inspector feel the weight of correction, "we must look also at the timing. Lady Penelope had already received the letter. The scrap was in a drawer which is not used daily. The idea that Miss Wentworth, who is learned in many things, would choose so publicly to leave a message in her own hand, and then commit something so clumsy as to be seen with a sachet. That is not elegant. The clever are not always apparent in their actions, but they do not usually give evidence that can be so easily tied unless they wish to mislead." The inspector's jaw tightened. "So you think she is innocent, Monsieur Poirot?" "I think," Poirot replied, "that we must not be dazzled by the first bright light that appears. It is a light that could blind. The scrap is a piece of a larger pattern, perhaps. The maid's testimony is a wave that could have been caused by a small stone or a large one. We must test the water. Miss Wentworth, you will allow me to see your epistolary book? And genteel, we shall compare the phrase, the ink, the cadence." Charlotte's eyes flashed, not in anger, but in the brief flare of being suspected. "I will cooperate," she said. "I'm tired of being suspected for truth-seeking." The assistant, who had quietly gone to fetch the book from her rooms, returned with a leather-bound volume filled with notes, drafts of letters, and marginalia in 4 languages. Poirot's fingers barely touched the pages as he allowed them to rest open. He did not declare the similarity vanished. He noted it. He also noted that the phrase had been written elsewhere in her volume, in different contexts, long before Lady Penelope's death. The ink on the scrap, when the inspector compared it, was slightly faded, older, perhaps. The maid's testimony, upon gentle rephrasing, revealed that she had seen a figure near the inner salon. But the angle and the light had made the perfume bottle appear to her wide-eyed interpretation like something more deliberate than casual. Inspector Mallory, frustrated by the retreat from his tidy construction, still held the scrap as though it were a key, and the room hummed with the tension of nearly closed judgment. Poirot allowed the possibility to hang, a possibility that Miss Wentworth had been involved, that perhaps she had attempted to confront. But he also left open the space that something else, more layered and more clever, used that possibility as a screen. He turned to me. "You see, Hastings, the first lead appears strong. The others will see it grow. It is the nature of human thought to seize upon the picture that fits best, rather than to keep watching the edges. We shall let them think the net tightens. It will show us, later, where the real corners shadow." Chapter 7. The Psychological Game. The scrap and the maid's frightened testimony had, as Poirot predicted, rippled through the gathering like the sudden appearance of a fog bank, obscuring, suggesting, unnerving. For a time attention had fallen on Miss Charlotte Wentworth. Whispers threaded corners of the salon, glances lengthened, and those with stakes to protect subtly shifted their position. Poirot, however, appeared untouched on the surface. Underneath, the little grey cells were at work, not on closing the net, but on arranging delicate snares. Questions that would reveal more in the way they were received than in the answers themselves. He began not with direct accusation, but with an invitation to speak of fear. He called together, in the smaller morning room, Mr. Alistair Crane and Count Vasilev, ostensibly to discuss the logistics of the proposed gallery and the business venture. I was left outside, peripherally listening, while Poirot orchestrated a subtle dance. Tell me, Poirot said to Crane, leaning forward. You are a man of numbers. Do you prefer certainty or the possibility of greater reward with risk? Crane smiled easily. One must weigh both, Monsieur Poirot. Risk, if calculated, becomes certainty of a different sort. Ah, Poirot replied, so you do not fear change, you embrace it. And yet, when Lady Penelope spoke tomorrow to adjust the arrangements, you felt something in the air, did you not? A hesitation in her voice made you look to the future to see if the ground under your plans would shift. Did that make you anxious? Crane's fingers paused mid-tap. Anxiety is a poor word. I am attentive. I prefer to understand shifting currents before being carried away. Attention, Poirot said softly, can sometimes masquerade as control, and control, when lost, is unpleasant. He allowed the statement to hang, not with threat, but with the suggestion of cause and effect. Crane's smile tightened fractionally, an almost imperceptible quiver, as if a carefully maintained mask had a crack forming at the edges. Then Poirot turned, seamlessly, to the Count. And you, Count Vasilev, you speak of light and legacy. A gallery is permanence. Yet the idea of memorializing someone presupposes their absence, oui? Did you ever consider that the very foundation of permanence is the flux that precedes it? The Count's eyes, which had often been distant, sharpened. You speak in riddles, Monsieur Poirot, he said lightly. I speak of the truth that frightens, Poirot countered. When one builds in honor, one has also seen the moment when the honored is no longer present. That moment changes the builder. It may make him tender, or it may make him defensive. Which are you, Count? I am practical, the Count answered, and yet there was a shadow in his tone, a flicker that suggested the question had landed where Poirot intended. He was not defensive outwardly, but there was a brief tightness at the corner of his mouth, a pause that betrayed some inner weighing of legacy against contingency. Poirot did not stop there. He expanded the game, bringing in Sir Edmund Harlow, who had remained distant from the immediate swirl, perhaps believing the first false lead would settle the matter and ease the pressure from his own position. Sir Edmund, Poirot said, you are a man who has had patrons, who has both given and received in the name of charity. When someone comes to you and changes terms, is the reaction to ask why, or to assert that the change is unwise? One must inquire, Sir Edmund replied with a certain hauteur, before assuming motive. Yes, Poirot agreed. Inquiry. And when the inquiry yields no satisfaction, what then? Does one wait patiently, or does one act to secure what was expected? Sir Edmund's expression flickered, as if caught between defending himself and realizing the import of the question. One adapts, he said finally. Adaptation, Poirot murmured. It is the word that covers both resilience and retreat. He held the others in those conversations long enough to let them feel the mild pressure of being considered, but not so long that they became defensive. That was the genius of his method, to apply a gentle tension, to invite the subject to reveal his own unease in replying. The answers, outwardly harmless, were each a small opening, a soft place in the shell, through which suspicion could later be directed with surgical precision. When he had set those verbal traps, he returned to Charlotte. He did not speak of the scrap now, but of trust. Mademoiselle, he said, you spoke of truth and lies. In your world, what is easier, to hold to the truth and watch those around you doubt, or to shade it so that it glides easily over the surface? Charlotte's composure wavered very slightly. The truth, Monsieur Poirot, is not always a single thing. It is many things coiled together. I prefer it uncoiled. The others prefer it pretty. Ah, Poirot responded, and yet the pretty lies sometimes keep peace. You prefer the sharpness. That makes enemies of those who have grown comfortable in silence. He watched her, not with malice, but with that penetrating attention which saw not only what she said, but what she swallowed. The conflict in her was clear. Loyalty to Lady Penelope, wounded by being left partially informed. The resentment of having to defend that loyalty. And the prick of being viewed with suspicion for simply seeking clarity. That mix, Poirot knew, could be used. By others, against her, or by her, if she sensed threat. Unless the currents were understood. Lydia Penn, the young secretary, had been left until now, almost deliberately. Poirot, in his quiet way, had invited her in as one who might have something to contribute and yet was too polite to take it upon herself to speak. She came with her hands folded, eyes downcast. "You have been seeing numbers, oui," Poirot said kindly, "and the shifting of them. How does it make you feel when you see changes without knowing why they are made?" "It confuses me, Monsieur Poirot," she whispered. "I do not know if I should question. I have been told to keep accounts, and suddenly things move. I think of mistakes, and then I think of—" She stopped, as if the thought itself startled her. "Of breach," Poirot supplied gently. "Yes. You are uncertain whether to speak, because the speaking might expose an error, or it might expose something more. That is a heavy burden for a young woman to carry alone." She nodded, and the admission, small though it was, placed her in a new light, not as a passive clerk, but as someone who had seen the edges of change and felt the tension it created. Poirot did not press further. He simply let her leave with a small encouragement to tell him anything, however small, that did not fit. When the afternoon wore on and the psychological game had widened, both the players and the watchers had begun to sense its rules. Poirot turned to me with a mild smile. "Hastings, the others believe they are being watched. That is good. The one who fears nothing is the one who has the room to move. The one who begins to dodge, we keep our eye. The lead on Miss Wentworth will occupy their eagerness. We must now see who, behind the eagerness, begins to direct the search elsewhere. The real cleverness is not in the bright accusation, but in the quiet redirection." Chapter 8. A secondary mystery. The afternoon settled with a brittle calm, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Poirot's words from the earlier conversations fluttered like carefully placed leaves around the room, some gathering in corners, others drifting, unseen but shaping currents. I was beginning to sense, as he did, that the first wave of suspicion had not cleared the waters, but only stirred deeper undercurrents. It was in that uneasy silence that a new disturbance arrived. Not a resolution, but another puzzle layered over the original, like a second voice echoing in a cavern and altering meaning. Lydia Penn had been summoned, quietly, under the pretense of reviewing some ledger discrepancies with the inspector. She came, pale, clasping a small black notebook to her chest, the one she used for her own marginal notes. The one she kept separate from her formal accounting books. It contained, we later learned, her private observations, things she had noticed that did not fit, questions she was afraid to ask, minor contradictions she had not been able to place. It was a small thing. But to Lydia, it was a scaffold of order amid the unsettled confusion. She had made tea in the small side room for herself and the inspector. Poirot, who had no official reason to be present but never was absent when currents shifted, sat nearby with his hands folded, watching lightly. Lydia took her first sip. Her face changed. The color drained, and she set the cup down with a slight tremor. "It is bitter," she murmured, and then her lips tightened. Her hand went instinctively to her throat, as if feeling for something unseen. Inspector Mallory, quick and practical, asked if she was all right. She replied that she felt faint. Poirot gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and quietly had the cup taken away. The maid, summoned post-haste, burned the remainder of the tea in the presence of Poirot and the inspector. There, at the bottom of the cup, the residue was thin and powdered, not something that would have come from ordinary leaves. Lydia, after regaining composure with the aid of a gentle glass of water, said she had placed her notebook beside the cup when the inspector had stepped out for a moment to fetch a form. When he returned, the notebook was gone. "A secondary attempt," Poirot observed, the corners of his mouth barely lifting. "Not on the original matter, but on the one who might see too much, the person who would wish to silence the watcher or to frighten her into silence." Lydia's hands shook. "I did not taste the poison until after the first sip. I thought it was the tea, and then I remembered. I'd left the notebook here. I came back and—" "It was gone," the inspector finished. "Taken while you were briefly absent." "Who would benefit from making you unwell?" Poirot asked gently. "Who, among those who fear seeing their name written in a small book, would wish for you to be quiet? Perhaps not a death. No, that would be too evident. A warning, a subtle threat. Or the removal of the one who quietly notes. I have not written names," Lydia whispered. "Just things that did not sit right. I wrote that Lady Penelope had been uneasy the night before, that Mr. Crane had been watching the account entries more often than usual, that Miss Wentworth had spoken sharply to someone on the phone once. I wrote that Sir Edmund had asked about the old promises. I wrote nothing definite." "That is precisely why you are dangerous to someone," Poirot said. "Not because you accuse, but because you notice and keep. The notebook is now gone. That means someone saw its value and either wished it hidden or wished you frightened." The inspector called for a search of the small rooms adjacent, but the notebook did not appear. Poirot requested that Lydia not speak of what she had written to anyone else for the moment, and he had the maid bring another cup of tea, prepared under his eyes, of course, and had it tasted. It was, predictably, untainted. He also asked for the remains of the first cup to be set aside, to be sent quietly for analysis, though he did not let the others see the urgency in the request. The implication had settled like a second stone dropped. Someone had tried to intimidate. Perhaps something further, and the attempt had been clumsy enough to fail, but significant enough to signal intent. "See, Hastings," he murmured to me in the quiet that followed. The first false lead was a bright flag. Now beneath it, a smaller, more dangerous tide moves. The one who would attempt to remove the watcher, she is not careless. She does not strike openly. She uses suggestion, fear, and disappearance. We have two puzzles now. One is loud, and the other is a whisper. The whisper is more likely to have the true answer. Lydia, emboldened by the fact that she had not fallen seriously ill yet shaken, was grateful for the quiet attention. She volunteered that the notebook had contained one phrase she was sure she had not written earlier, a small penciled note in her own hand, but in a different ink that read, "The watcher sees what comfort would bury." She insisted she had never written it. Poirot tilted his head. "That could have been a plant," he said quietly, intended to make Lydia doubt her own memory, to deflect from the actual things she had seen. There was no grand accusation. There was, instead, a multiplication of unease. The secondary event did not settle the earlier questions. It reframed them. The person who had taken the notebook had not only wanted to deprive, but also to misdirect, suggesting that the watcher was unreliable, that perhaps the notebook's contents were not to be trusted, and that something unseen could be placed in her mind. "Who among our circle," Poirot mused aloud, "has both motive to silence observation and access to be subtle? The one who can move without stirring the obvious. The one who can make a notebook vanish as easily as a well-turning phrase." He left the question dangling, as he always did when he wished others to fill their own emptiness with their own unease. The new mystery, less violent but more intimate, had shifted the playing field. Now there were those who watched the watchers and those who feared they were being watched. The game, already complicated, had gained another layer, and the tension between the spoken and the hidden had grown sharper. Chapter 9. Hidden Connections. The addition of the second, quieter wound had shifted the atmosphere in the Langley house. What had been a fractured circle of suspicion now became a lattice, interwoven, complex, with threads crossing where none had been visible before. Poirot, alert to nuance, had that particular look of a man who saw not isolated pieces, but patterns emerging from their intersections. He turned now to the task of finding the secret ties that bound people together, the loyalties and resentments that existed beneath courteous titles. He began with a coy, casual question to Sir Edmund Harlow when the group had gathered in a smaller sitting room under the pretense of rest. "Sir Edmund," he said, "you have given and you have received. The giving often creates debts not always recorded. Do you know the feeling one has when a promise changes? It is as if one that was unspoken becomes suddenly currency." Sir Edmund's fingers drummed briefly on the arm of his chair. "I gave funds to the hospital under the understanding Lady Penelope, and I shared the same vision. If she altered the terms without agreement, that is a change. I'm not blind to the inconvenience it causes." "Inconvenience," Poirot repeated, tilting his head. "It is interesting that you do not call it betrayal. Yet you came to her, did you not? You asked for clarification, and when none was given, you did not push further. That, perhaps, is because of something else, an old tie, n'est-ce pas? One tension is softened by another." "I do not understand what you are implying," Sir Edmund said, watching him carefully. "You give, to be remembered," Poirot said. "You receive, to be forgiven. When those terms shift unexpectedly, a quiet obligation often becomes a silent threat. There are, in charity, invisible contracts. They bind differently." He let the thought settle, then turned to Lord Granville. "You have been, for generations, the weaver of alliances. The relationships among these people are not accidental. You know who is close to whom, and who owes what to whom. Have you observed any links that might explain the quiet attempt on Lydia Penn? A watchful eye often sees where threads cross." Lord Granville, who had the expression of one who did not like to speculate openly, considered. The young secretary saw things. That suggests more than careless movement. People who are connected, even distantly, share knowledge without speaking. Mrs. Harcourt and Lady Penelope discussed old promises. Miss Wentworth and Lady Penelope spoke bitterly about funds. Mr. Crane has been involved with the financial side of the gallery proposal, which touches on the legacy Sir Edmund hoped to secure through charitable naming. "Legacy touches legacy," Poirot murmured. "And when two legacies come close, there is friction. Friction that can produce heat, and heat that can burn the one who does not notice it until it is too late." He then drew out the small, seemingly benign connection that had not yet been spoken of, the fact that Mrs. Evelyn Harcourt had been a guest at a luncheon the previous month where Count Vasilev had been introduced to Lady Penelope's circle. They had conversed now and then, at least in the polite public sense, about art, memory, and the idea of keeping promises. Yet the real link lay elsewhere. Mrs. Harcourt had, in private, once mentioned to a mutual acquaintance that she had once been in possession of a considered favor from a foreign nobleman, a favor that, through a series of social debts, had tangled back into the world of a gallery earlier proposed by the Count. That favor, in language of society, had been called a quiet endorsement. It was not the sort of thing one shouted. It was the sort that could be invoked softly, if needed, to steer a project, to nudge a memorial, or to hold back a threatening detail. Poirot's attention then moved, methodically, to the more overlooked threads. He asked Miss Charlotte Wentworth, in a tone that suggested curiosity rather than accusation, about her relationship with Lydia Penn. "You recommended her, no?" he said. "You are of a world where one's circle feeds one another. The young girl is quiet, yes, but she is linked to you. She sees what you watch. Does she carry your judgments, or does she bring her own?" Charlotte's lips pressed together. "I suggested her to Lady Penelope because she seemed capable. I had no idea she would become a sort of unintentional sentinel. She's not my agent. She is observant. That is all." "And yet," Poirot replied, People who are given the small tools of others tend, if they are faithful, to use them in similar angles. Perhaps she noticed things because you had taught her to look. That is not to blame you. It only shows that the web is not simple. The watcher watches also through her. Miss Wentworth's gaze flicked to Lydia, who stood near the doorway, white-faced but steady. She did not speak further, but her silence added weight. Poirot's mind then turned to the peculiar adjacency of the gallery proposal, the shift in philanthropic priorities, and the subtle, almost unspoken competition between those who wished to be remembered in certain lights. "When one builds a memorial," he said aloud, "one chooses the story told. When the story is threatened by another, small helpers appear." He did not name whom he meant. The others, however, began to glance at each other, sensing an implication that was not yet fully formed, a suggestion that the secondary mystery of Lydia's notebook and the primary one of Lady Penelope's death were not merely parallel, but perhaps braided. He ended the session by returning briefly to Count Vasilev. "Your gallery, and the way you spoke of light," Poirot said. "Do you understand that light can reveal and also hide, depending on the angle? A memorial built too quickly can cover more than it reveals." "It is not the memorial that hides, Monsieur Poirot," the Count replied with a soft edge. "It is the intention behind it." "Exactly," Poirot said, with a small smile that carried no comfort. "Intention, the secret language that binds the visible and the invisible." As the afternoon waned, the web of connections multiplied, not into confusion, but into depth. Each person carried more than a single motive now. They carried ties to others, obligations, debts, soft power, emotional inheritances. The simple circle of suspects had become a network, and the truth, Poirot knew, resided in the places where those quiet, hidden connections touched and sometimes crossed in ways that created friction or cover. He kept the question of the notebook's disappearance and its relationship to these linkages close, letting it simmer as a quiet pressure beneath the growing complexity. Chapter 10. Poirot's secret clue. The net of relationships, motives, and veiled intentions had grown dense enough that any careless tug might tear the fabric. Poirot, ever the cautious weaver, did not pull. Instead, he held the threads lightly between his fingers, turning them so that their subtle colors and patterns became visible. The first false lead had faded into the background, the secondary wound had deepened suspicion, and the lattice of hidden connections had given rise to a texture in which the smallest oddity could no longer hide. It was in that texture, in a place where none of the others had thought to look twice, that Poirot had found his secret clue, a quiet discrepancy that bent the whole shape of the affair without shouting for attention. It was, as so often with him, not something dramatic. The clue lay in Lady Penelope's gloves. They had been brought earlier from her dressing chamber, wrapped carefully and placed on the small side table. On the surface, they were perfect, pale kid, trimmed delicately, the sort one expected with a lady of her station. Poirot had glanced at them several times in passing, noting the faint scent that still lingered, mingling with the perfume from the letter, and filed that observation away like a line in a ledger. It had become, in the cascade of newer revelations, something not mentioned aloud until now. He called me to the conservatory, under the pretense of wanting to show me something with the eye of the amateur gardener. The sun slanted through the glass, making patterns of vessel shadows on the marble. He placed the gloves between us, and his fingertips, as always, barely touched. He did not speak of the obvious softness or the quality. He lifted one gently, and on the inner seam, where one would not expect wear except through frequent use, there was a faint smear, not of dirt, but of a colorless residue, almost invisible unless one knew precisely where to look. "You see, Hastings," he said, his voice low, "the clever often cover their steps with polished surfaces. It is the little thing forgotten, the small fold that betrays. These gloves, Lady Penelope wore them when she received the letter, Yet there is something here. He tapped the seam. This is not the sort of smudge one acquires in the carriage or in polite conversation. It is a trace left by contact with something else. Note the absence of scent here. The perfume that lingered in the room is not on the gloves. She did not leave the inner salon with her gloves on. That is expected, but— He paused, allowing the observation to settle. She had them recently removed. Why would she, in the privacy of her own salon, remove them and place them here, if not to examine something herself? And yet, the residue. It is on the inside, as if something had touched her hand while the gloves were off, and then the gloves were replaced without washing. This is not merely the mark of a lady adjusting her attire. This is the mark of someone who has, in secret, touched something that required caution and then returned to the acceptable appearance. Something she handled herself, I asked. Oui, Poirot replied. But that is not the full. There is more. Look at the stitching. See how the thread has been slightly nicked here. He pointed to a nearly invisible nick near the cuff. It was not noticeable unless one is very small. It is new. It is not a tear from use. It is the sort of nick made by a fine knife, one that might be used to open something delicate, perhaps to lift a seal, perhaps to remove a small fastening. Lady Penelope is careful. She would not damage her gloves lightly. She did not do this by accident. Does this mean she had recently opened something? The letter? A box? A secret compartment? It means, Poirot said, that she handled something that required the use of a knife, something she did not want others to see her open openly. She did so herself, with her gloves on, then removed them to touch, and replaced them. That shows both secrecy and the desire to maintain her appearance. Perhaps she received a visitor and took a small action alone. Perhaps she sought something. Perhaps she learned something from the letter and acted to confirm. The clue is not yet a solution. It is a pivot. He wrapped the gloves again, with care, and slid them back toward the small velvet case in which they had been originally displayed. We keep this between us for the moment, he said quietly. If we speak it too soon, the one who did not expect it will divert, and the trace will be lost. I have the impression that Lady Penelope was not merely recipient. She was active after the receipt. She was attempting something. The question is, what? He did not yet voice the full implication. Who might have had cause to fear that action? Who might have seen her strange, solitary movement? Or who could have known that she had changed her gloves in that manner? He rolled the image, small and private, like a bead in his palm. It was the sort of secret that, once wielded at the correct moment, could unbalance a careful web. Returning to the main room, he resumed his quiet watch. The others continued their cautious moves, unaware that beneath the surface of their own stories, a new axis had been discovered. The gloves, so ordinary at first glance, had become in Poirot's mind the hinge on which a portion of the evening turned, a secret clue that connected Lady Penelope's private anxiety with an act of concealment. He kept it close, folding it into the growing hypothesis without revealing it to those whose nerves were already taut. The little grey cells had taken their new piece. They would wait, observe how the currents shifted, and then use it when the time was precise. Chapter 11. Tensions rise. The discovery of the glove's secret trace, held like a quiet ember by Poirot, had not yet been aired to the others, but its presence was felt in the subtle tightening of the atmosphere. The net of suspicion, already intricate, began to shift under pressure, not from dramatic accusations, but from the slow, inevitable sliding of people adjusting their positions, testing loyalties, and probing for advantage. It was then that the true shape of tension became visible, not as open conflict, but as the way alliances formed briefly over shared uncertainty and then dissolved when someone else's glance suggested a deeper, less spoken motive. Miss Charlotte Wentworth, who had been the focus of the first false lead and the one who had carried the weight of polite suspicion, now found herself being watched not only by those who distrusted her, but by those who had once aligned with her concerns. Mr. Alistair Crane, whose own anxieties had been teased subtly by Poirot, began speaking more often with Lord Granville. Their conversations, at first framed around logistics and the possible impact of the scandal on the gallery proposal, took on a softer, sharper edge. The word stability crept into their phrases. Lord Granville, who had long regarded the web of alliances as something he could ease or tighten with gentle pressure, now appeared wary. He adjusted his posture when Sir Edmund approached, as if anticipating that the shifting loyalties might expose fissures in what had been solid ground. Sir Edmund Harlow, feeling the currents change, began to align himself quietly with Mrs. Evelyn Harcourt. His philanthropy, once a banner of goodwill, now carried a subtle, defensive tone. He listened more intently to her talk of old promises, and she, in turn, started to frame her own memories with careful phrases. As you know, becoming, as I feared, might be the case. Their mutual interest in Lady Penelope's shifting decisions, which had once been separate concerns, now curled together, forming a tentative understanding that perhaps each had been, in their own way, displaced. That alliance, quiet though it was, gave strength to their position and produced a soft push against those who questioned them. Count Vasilev, who had watched from a distance as his memorial plans intertwined with the estate's turbulence, began to speak less in public and more in private. He sought out Lydia Penn, gently, offering the sort of concern that seemed innocent, which, of course, was the most effective kind. "The little ones in the machine see more than they know," he observed one afternoon, in that carefully ambiguous fashion. "They carry threads to those who would pull them without realizing the hand at the other end." Lydia, who had been trying to stay invisible, bristled slightly at the remark. The Count noticed and let the silence hold, as if the implication, that she might be observed beyond her own awareness, was enough to unsettle her. Mrs. Harcourt, meanwhile, had become attentive to Miss Wentworth's movements, not overtly, but as one might watch a rival's chess piece. Her inquiries, framed as concern for the smooth handling of charitable reputation, veiled an examination of whether Charlotte was gaining sympathy again, or whether she had, in fact, become a liability. "People change their stories when they feel threatened," she remarked to Sir Edmund in private, "and some change them when their position shifts. One must be careful who one trusts with memory." "Memory is an odd thing," Sir Edmund responded. "It is both ally and adversary. We who have given much are sometimes forgotten in the moments we need remembering most." The interplay had a rhythm, and into that rhythm Poirot dipped quietly. He allowed the tensions to simmer and the suspects to flex, because in the movement one could see the real shape of fear and ambition. He did not force alliances. He merely created spaces where the interior discomforts could surface without overt pressure, letting those small inconsistencies, an odd glance, a hesitation in phrasing, the way one person leaned slightly toward another and then withdrew, become visible to him and to one another in indirect ways. "Do you notice, Hastings," he said to me in a moment when he and I were alone in the corridor, "how the pressure is not from accusation, but from proximity? Those who share concern, even if their concerns differ, begin to form alliances. They are not based on truth yet. They are based on the fear of being isolated. It is a delicate thing. The one who is alone begins to adjust, to seek footholds, and in doing so reveals their own necessity." "And the one with the missing notebook?" I asked. "Does that make her a target in new ways?" "Oui," Poirot replied. "The watcher has now been watched. That makes others cautious of her and makes her cautious of others. She's both valuable and vulnerable. That is dangerous. The gloves—" He stopped himself. The unspoken detail held again. "Have whispered to me that Lady Penelope had taken action. That action, unknown to the others, is now a shadow behind their words. The tension arises from those who sensed the movement and those who fear the exposure. The playing field shifts, but not in open view. One must look to the small tremors. The tension, as it rose, presented one unmistakable quality. The suspects were beginning to adjust their stories, not in response to direct questions, but in anticipation of what others might suspect. The anticipation created new inconsistencies. Mr. Crane began to mention, in passing, the idea that the gallery could adapt to posthumous honorifics, implying that the memorial could serve multiple purposes, shifting the framing away from what Lady Penelope had intended. Miss Wentworth became more guarded, her speech measured now not only because of her own internal conflict, but because she felt the eyes of those who had once supported her wavering, as if they waited to see if she would falter again. What is the consequence, Poirot mused quietly, of a web in which everyone is adjusting to the fear of others adjusting? The answer is not in the loud statement, it is in the small, unmade decision. When someone chooses to protect a lie by reinforcing another, they overcommit. That creates a crack. He let the others feel the pressure, without revealing where it came from, and watched as the quiet power plays expanded the field of potential movement. Alliances that had seemed solid enough to withstand suspicion now showed the tiniest fractures. A misworded phrase, a slightly delayed reply, a glance that lingered longer than politeness warranted. These were the signs that the tensions were rising toward something that would no longer be containable by polite restraint. Chapter 12. The confrontation, the rising tensions, having loosened the carefully knitted facades of the guests, now gave way to the first true test of pressure. Poirot, who had watched the shifting alliances and adjustments with the patience of a man waiting for the precise moment to strike, chose his opening with the same care he took in laying a delicate trap. He did not seek a confession then. He sought a crack, something small enough to appear natural, yet large enough to reveal a hidden hand. The one he turned to was Sir Edmund Harlow, and by extension, the quiet, symbiotic presence of Mrs. Evelyn Harcourt. They had been lingering near the library, ostensibly discussing the nuances of Lady Penelope's charitable endowments. Poirot invited them to the morning room under the pretext of reviewing a minor detail of the gallery's proposed inscription. I followed, as I always did, with a certain mixture of curiosity and a desire to be of practical assistance. The room had the soft light of late afternoon, and that silence of people who believed they spoke in confidence. "Sir Edmund," Poirot began lightly, "you spoke with Mrs. Harcourt of old promises. One would think that a promise, given long ago, would hold weight even when the present shifts. Yet you, who have given so much to the world, seem to take a step back when Lady Penelope's terms changed. Why?" Sir Edmund, who had grown used to covering discomfort with measured tone, did not flinch. "Monsieur Poirot, things change, the world changes. Lady Penelope's reconsiderations were her prerogative. I only wished for clarity." "And clarity," Poirot replied, "is sometimes the comfort that prevents one from seeing the movement beneath. Mrs. Harcourt, you have been a companion to many changes. You have seen promises bent, shifted, broken, perhaps. You, who speak of memory, know how the past can be reshaped by the present." Mrs. Harcourt inclined her head with a mild, sympathetic expression. "We all guard what we can. Lady Penelope was doing that in her own way. I only wish to protect the good that has come from the intentions of the past." Poirot's eyes, which had been soft, sharpened fractionally. "You both are very concerned with appearance. That is admirable. Many would not notice the small slips. Yet, Sir Edmund, you said earlier that you adapted when things changed. Adaptation can be graceful. It can also be the word used by one who rearranges evidence to fit a newly convenient story." Sir Edmund's jaw tightened just perceptibly. "I would not accuse you of malice, Monsieur Poirot, in the same way I would not accuse the deceased of making poor choices." "Ah," Poirot said, smiling slightly. And yet the phrase that was placed in the notebook of the young secretary, "The watcher sees what comfort would bury," that was, I was told, a phrase that belonged not to her, but appeared among her notes unexpectedly. It implies that someone has been observing the observers, and that comfort is the place where truth is hidden. Mrs. Harcourt's face did not change. Sir Edmund, however, gave a small involuntary glance toward her, and in that glance there was the first tell, a fraction of surprise, as if the phrase had landed from a source he did not expect. "You have heard of that?" Mrs. Harcourt said lightly. "Lydia is fractious with fear. She imagines things." "Imagination," Poirot said, tilting his head, "can be fed. The phrase suggests that there is a barrier created by ease. Those who claim comfort often hide sharp edges beneath. Sir Edmund, you have spoken of memory being both ally and adversary. It is curious that the notebook, which once contained observations, now loses its author the moment she is uneasy." Sir Edmund's composure wavered. "You speak as if I had something to do with the disappearance of the notebook." "No," Poirot interjected softly. "I speak as if someone, knowing that the watcher observes the shifting of those we call friends, wished that the watcher would doubt herself. The phrase in question—" He paused, allowing the weight of the sentence to sit. Sir Edmund, who had heard it, answered too quickly. "It is the sort of phrase one would use when one wishes to soften the idea of exposure," he said. "It is a warning to those who look too closely." Poirot's little grey cells stirred. The remark was slight, but the error lay in its shape. The phrase, until that moment, had been held as something private, known only to Poirot and Lydia. Sir Edmund's knowing reference to its purpose as a warning to those who look too closely betrayed more than he intended. It was language that implied familiarity, not with what Lydia had voiced, but with what had been subtly planted to misdirect her. Language that suggested someone had fed him the very doubt he now expressed, a soft feathering of suggestion meant to steer attention away from a deeper fault line. Poirot leaned in. "You see, Hastings," he murmured, so that only I could hear, "the one under pressure does not always break. Sometimes he overreaches to control the narrative, and in doing so, gives us what we seek." Sir Edmund, sensing perhaps that he had spoken beyond his control, covered more quickly. "I only meant that observation can frighten. We are all unsettled." "And yet fear," Poirot said, lifting his finger just enough, "can be a lever. The one who applies it carefully can move others without seeming to push. I wonder who would wish for the watcher to feel uncertain of her own records, thereby deflecting her gaze." Mrs. Harcourt, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "You are suggesting, Monsieur Poirot, that someone has manufactured doubt." "I'm suggesting," Poirot replied, "that the appearance of doubt is intentional. The one who seeks to hide behind comfort will place a whisper in the mind of another and then claim surprise when the whisper seems like a memory. That is cleverness. We shall see if it holds under light." The tension, created by that small error, had not exploded into open accusation. It had, however, placed a seed of doubt that spread internally in the quiet manner Poirot desired. Sir Edmund retreated slightly, no longer certain of how his position would appear when examined from another angle, and Mrs. Harcourt maintained a poised facade, with a slight looseness now in her usual control. Poirot, meanwhile, had not yet indicated his full suspicions, only that the first movement had been made. The confrontation, subtle as it was, had yielded the crucial slip, a moment in which a man under pressure used the language of deflection and, in doing so, revealed that he was being guided, perhaps unwillingly, by a voice he did not fully command. Chapter 13. A desperate attempt to escape. The small fracture Poirot had coaxed in the last confrontation had not dissolved. It had widened imperceptibly, like a hairline crack in fine porcelain. People moved with a new care. Words were chosen as if weighed against unseen scales. Alliances, tentative and shifting, were tinged with suspicion of their own formation. Yet beneath all the polite adjustments and concealed wariness, a different current surged, one of active fear. The person who had orchestrated suggestion and planted hesitation felt the noose tighten, and in such moments, cleverness either retreats into stillness or lashes out in a sudden, desperate attempt to change the board. It was shortly after dusk when the alarm, small and dissonant in the quiet main corridor, sounded. Not a scream, not an overt shout, just that thin, high note that belonged to the private alarm connected to Lady Penelope's study. The sound moved like a needle through the soft fabric of the evening, and servants appeared from doorways with eyes wide, thrusting themselves forward in that practiced anxiety that comes when something has broken the expected rhythm. Poirot was already moving, not hurriedly, but with that purposeful precision of his. I followed, and behind us came Inspector Mallory, Count Vasilev, and the restless form of Mr. Alistair Crane. The inner study door was locked. The maid who had been in the outer corridor fumbled with a key. The handle turned. Poirot held up his hand. Just a small gesture, nothing theatrical. He did not want a rush that might disturb the scene. The door opened slowly. Inside, Lydia Penn sat with her back to the large window, her chair angled as if she had been waiting for someone, her hands wrapped around a small parcel of paper tied with black thread. Her face was pale, and her eyes were wide with a mixture of shock and something sharper, defensiveness. The notebook was on the desk, closed, but there was a visible smear across the outer page, as if someone had tried to erase something hastily. The teacup she had drunk from earlier was nearby, untouched now, and the air carried that faint metallic tang that Poirot had smelled before when he suspected interference. "I was only writing," Lydia said, voice steady but thin. "I heard a sound. You thought someone came to take it again." Poirot finished gently. "You placed it here, to protect it." "It was gone," she said quickly. "I found it back here, on the floor near the shelf. It should have been in the drawer. I thought—" Her hands curled around the small parcel. "I thought to hide it. I did not know what else to do." Inspector Mallory, already with his notebook open, stepped closer to the desk. The parcel's black thread was broken, just frayed at one end as if it had been hastily undone. The room, which had seemed quiet, now had that electric tension of a place where something irreversible was about to happen. Crane, standing a pace behind, watched Lydia with a hawk's narrowed focus. Count Vasilev's expression had that studied detachment, though his eyes flicked occasionally to the hallway as if measuring potential exits. "It appears," Poirot said, "that someone has tried to make you move, mademoiselle. To force you, not to speak but to act. The alarm, who triggered it?" "I did," Lydia answered. "I thought it would bring help. I was going to show the inspector what had been written, to prove I had not lost my mind. I heard movement. I saw a shadow near the bookcase. I thought to defend it. I triggered it by accident when I stood up. I meant to call for Monsieur Poirot. I did not want to." "Run," Poirot supplied softly. And I saw it then, the way her hands tightened. "Ah, someone wishes you to appear guilty by being caught. The movement of the notebook, and its sudden return, was a pressure. The alarm was pulled when you stood, not because of panic, but because you were watching the approach of one who was not invited." Inspector Mallory moved to the bookcase. "There are scratches here," he said, pointing to the lower edge of the polished wood, as if someone had tried to pry something loose. "And here," he lifted a small panel. Behind it, recessed into the wall, was a narrow, empty cavity. It was the sort of hidden space a private item could be slipped into and vanished. The inside of the panel had marks, evidence of recent use. The varnish had been disturbed at a fresh edge. Poirot's gaze shifted swiftly to Lydia. "You did not know of this?" he asked. She shook her head. No, I have never seen it. Someone has used it recently, Poirot said. To move something. Something they did not want to be seen. Perhaps a note. Perhaps the thing you had feared to lose. Crane, whose attention had been torn between Lydia and that small aperture, now stiffened. It appears, he said slowly, that someone has been hiding more than courage in this room. Lady Penelope had secrets. Secrets that moved. Yes, Poirot replied, and the one who would have used a hidden space to conceal now sees the watcher unsettled and acts. To confuse, to misdirect, to make her movement appear like guilt. The attempt was desperate. That is why the alarm was triggered. Not by the intruder, but by her. Who would benefit, the inspector asked, by making her seem unstable? By hiding something where she would find a trace and then be forced to react? Someone who is feeling pressure, Poirot said, and fears the small grey cells that look. The attempt to force her into movement, into explanation, was made to distract from the real hiding place. But the hidden pain is not the only thing. The one who used it knows she is watched. That is why the movement was not to destroy the notebook, but to frighten. Lydia's breath caught. They were close, she whispered. I felt them. I thought I saw the corner of a sleeve. I heard... A faint brush, Poirot said. Yes. The one who came did not wish to be seen. They wanted you to think you were losing comprehension. That is cruel and clever. He turned his eyes to the doorway where, from the shadows, a footman had begun to back away, as if he had seen nothing. Poirot's gaze, however, did not linger there. He had seen the way Sir Edmund's expression, when the hidden space was revealed, had slipped for a moment, a micron of tightening at the corner of his mouth, a small swallow. He did not accuse. He watched. The desperate attempt had failed in one part. Lydia was not silenced. It had succeeded for a breath in pushing her into action that could be framed as instability. That was the way the clever often operated. Strike soft, make the watcher doubt. Let confusion bleed outward. Poirot, having seen the shape of the attempt, folded it inward, letting it settle like a small sharp stone in the pool. He now had not one but two active threads, the one who wished to misdirect the watcher and the one who had hidden something in the wall, afraid of exposure. He spoke quietly to the inspector. We keep the panel quiet for now. We let the others believe the alarm was a mistake. We watch who moves when the hidden place remains empty. The one who is tempted to fill it again will show themselves by the tension of their breath. Lydia, steadied by Poirot's calm, nodded. The desperate attempt to escape had not been a flight, but a push, meant to unsettle, to obscure. The real movement now would come from whomever believed they had, for the moment, diverted attention. They would act next, and Poirot, waiting with patient precision, would be ready. Chapter 14. The final piece falls into place. The failed attempt to frighten Lydia Penn, the discovery of the hidden panel, the subtle slip in Sir Edmund's language. These events had not resolved anything, but they had rearranged the landscape. Each movement left its shadow. Poirot, who had collected them like rare shells along a beach, now began to see how they fitted together, not as isolated curiosities, but as segments of a larger, quieter architecture. The tension, previously a rising pressure between individuals, folded inward, and something like a pattern, once blurred, sharpened along edges that had been previously soft. He spent the morning in silence, more than was his custom. He spoke little, yet watched much. He allowed the others to feel the weight of their own uncertainty, and in watching them, he observed the compensations they made, the small adjustments of posture, the deliberate changes in phrasing, the way one person's glance affixed to another as if seeking permission to speak. In that silence, the final piece, so small that it might have been overlooked even by a careful mind, slid into place. It was not the gloves, not the notebook, not even the hidden panel alone. but the conjunction of those things with a remark made hours before in casual conversation. Count Vasilev had been speaking, quite openly and with that easy manner of his, about the nature of remembrance. He had said, with a half-smile, "It is curious how people hide what they intend to reveal in public and reveal what they wish to hide in private." He had not meant it as a confession, of course. It was a general observation, cast as a witticism, but it was the way he had coupled that comment later with a faint reference to the careful removal of a something that might show one's hand that gave Poirot the alignment he needed. The phrase stuck because of its resonance with the glove's nick, the hidden panel, and the psychological pressure placed on Lydia to tether her trust inward. He called the small group together again, not for confrontation, but for quiet re-examination. Miss Charlotte Wentworth, Mr. Crane, Lord Granville, and Mrs. Harcourt were present. He began by laying out what had been known, the letter, the first false lead, the secondary attempt to silence the watcher, and the web of connections. He did not name names. He let the air settle around the implications, and then, slowly, he added what was subtler, the gloves and their secret trace, the hidden cavity in Lady Penelope's study, and the manner in which the watcher had been unsettled by the attempt to plant doubt. "It is the peculiar conjunction," Poirot said, "that gives clarity. A person who hides wishes to appear comfortable. A person who is uncomfortable wishes to appear hidden. Lady Penelope," he continued, "did not merely receive a letter. She acted upon it. She sought something. She used her gloves, then removed them, handled with care what she wished to examine privately, and then replaced them to present her usual perfection. She did not do this in haste. That tells us the movement was deliberate. The person who saw that movement, who knew of that quiet action, had reason to fear the knowledge and acted to divert. They frightened the watcher, made her seem uncertain, and created a false motion to cover what had been hidden in the wall." Mr. Crane shifted slightly, eyes flicking to the Count with something like a question. "You meant the memorial to be lasting," Poirot went on, "and yet it was discussed in terms that would, on surface, bring advantage to others. To build a memorial is to select a story, but to shift that story requires someone to have both access and influence. The hidden place suggests secrecy of another order. The question is, who among us sees too many things and yet wants us to look elsewhere?" Mrs. Harcourt's fingers, which had been curled around her teacup, loosened. She did not comment. Lord Granville, always cautious, placed a hand near the edge of the small table as if to steady himself on invisible ground. Poirot paused, and then, with that seeming lightness which had always been the most dangerous of his methods, he said, "The last piece that fell into place for me was not merely the comment about hidden revelation. It was the way the one who wishes to direct the narrative used language that belonged to another's doubt. The phrase about the watcher, the one that came from the young secretary's notes, was spoken later by someone who should not have known it unless it had been offered to him as a soft cushion against the sharpness of observation. That cushion was placed to protect, not by deflection alone, but by suggestion. Suggestion becomes control when it appears as one's own thought." Charlotte's expression hardened fractionally, and I could see her weighing whether to correct or to feign ignorance. The others appeared outwardly calm, yet the air had that small crackling quality to it, like the moment before a storm that has not yet declared itself. "All of you," Poirot said, "have shown concern, in one form or another, for the preservation of what you value, legacy, reputation, honor, promises. That is not wrong. The wrong lies in arranging the appearance of truth so that the real movements hide behind it. The one who has felt pressure most recently is the one who redirected attention with an almost tender care, making the watcher doubt her own fidelity before the watcher could expose the truth that the owner of the comfortable veneer fears most. He let silence sit after that. It is an exquisite thing. Silence in a room where suspects begin to hear their own names echoed softly in implication, The final piece had not yet allowed him to speak the whole, but it had given him the axis, a central tension from which the rest would spin. The alignment of the secret glove handling, the hidden concealment, the planted doubt, and the borrowed phrase provided the clarity of a hinge about to open. He turned then, almost gently, toward me. "Hastings, we have the outline. The coming movement will be the one who believes they have covered their tracks. They will not flee. They will adjust, perhaps even attempt to justify. The person who attempts to justify too eagerly is the one closest to the pressure." I could see behind his calm the quiet anticipation. The final piece had fallen into place not with a crescendo, but with the soft click of a lock aligning. Now the slow, patient reveal could begin to take shape. The unweaving starting at the correct moment, one that would be precise, measured, and devastating in its logic. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. The drawing room, which had been the site of shifting loyalties, whispered suspicions, and invisible maneuverings, now held a different weight. The earlier elegant ease had been replaced by a quiet formality. Invitations had gone out, simple, polite requests from Poirot, asking that all those concerned assemble in the largest salon that evening. There was no announcement of accusation, only the sense, among the invited, that something decisive would now unfold. It was the moment when the loose threads of conversation, observation, and misdirection would be drawn taut for the first time in common sight. They came, each with their own composure adjusted. Miss Charlotte Wentworth entered first, her face composed but her eyes carrying the faint shadow of the earlier pressure. Sir Edmund Harlow was there, outwardly calm, though his hands, visible, not tucked away, barely betrayed a tremor. Mrs. Evelyn Harcourt moved with that quiet precision of someone who had always known how to sit at the edge of influence without appearing to lean. Lord Granville, who had watched the network of connections with the instinct of its architect, stood near the fireplace, his posture measured. Count Vasilev came with that continental ease that was now tempered by a glance that carried an undercurrent of caution. Mr. Poole. Alistair Crane had lingered, ostensibly late, giving the impression of casualness that sat uneasily with the evening. Lydia Penn remained respectfully in the background, clutching a small notebook to her chest, the watcher now watched, but steadied by Poirot's earlier quiet support. Poirot arranged them as if composing a picture. The center left open, the edges occupied, the tensions implied by slight distances and connections. He had asked for the inspector to be present. Mallory, notebook in hand, took his place with a silent readiness. There was no need for overt ceremony. The gathering itself, in its composition of carefully placed persons, was the preface. "My friends," Poirot began, in that voice that did not demand attention so much as gently collected it, "we have been in the middle of a very curious performance. Each of you has played a part. Some of you have acted with intention, some have reacted. The affair is not yet complete. It is like a picture half painted. Some colors bold, some faint, and in the middle, a space waiting for light." He did not begin with the accusation. He began with the small details, calling them back as if retracing the steps of a walk in fog. Lady Penelope received a letter that was not finished, a letter that smelled of a perfume that had traveled. That is the first thing. Then a note, similar in phrasing, was found. A watcher, young, earnest, observant, was made uncertain. A hidden place was revealed in the study. A movement was seen in gloves, secretly handled. There have been adjustments, suggestions, protections, and diversions. Each of you has had a reason to care what others see, and each of you has felt the pressure of what might be uncovered. He paused, allowing the breadth of the assembled fact to settle like a soft fog. Eyes moved slightly. No one spoke. "It is not my intention," Poirot continued, "to make dramatic speeches. That is not how truth emerges. It emerges when the careful alignment of the small and the big show a shape. We are here tonight, not because the case is resolved, but because the shape is now seen clearly enough to invite questions. The final gathering is not for the revealing of what has been done, but for the preparation of what will be seen. He turned his gaze with deliberate slowness, first to Miss Wentworth. You sought truth in complications of charity and legacy. You are not, how does one say, an unthinking actor. You weigh, you watch. The first bright flag was planted upon you because you question. That is not a crime. It is a vulnerability. Charlotte nodded, her lips thin. No reply. Her silence held its own meaning. She understood she had been seen, and also that she had been used as a screen. He moved imperceptibly to Sir Edmund and Mrs. Harcourt. You have been tied by promises, spoken and unspoken. You have adjusted to change. You are, as I said before, men and women of giving. The lines of debt, gratitude, and expectation run so close that comfort hides tension. Those who feel their position shift often wish to stabilize. Stabilization, quietly, can become direction. Sir Edmund's fingers curled slightly around his chair, and Mrs. Harcourt's gaze held no overt betrayal, but her posture reflected the weight of implication placed by measure of language. Poirot then addressed Count Vasilev and Mr. Crane. You both use the language of legacy and change. The building of memory is public. The shifting of memory can be private. The ease with which one moves between those spheres gives influence. The weakness in the public statement is often a cover for the private movement. Crane's jaw tightened. The Count's eyes narrowed fractionally, as if evaluating if those words were aimed precisely or brushstroked broadly. Finally, Poirot turned to Lydia, quietly, with the respect of one who had placed the watcher into the center without making her a spectacle. You, mademoiselle, have been the one who saw and then was made to doubt. That is a clever device. The one who would cause doubt knows the value of silence and the danger of exposure. You did not speak until you were sure. That delayed movement has cost nothing. It has preserved much. He allowed that to rest, and then, with a slight change in tone, still calm but more focused, he said, We are here now to allow those who know to feel the order of things. The one who believes they have arranged the confusion will think the moment safe. The one who believes their control unshakable will look away. That is the moment when the truth, which is already present, will step forward. He did not yet disclose his ultimate grouping. He left the audience with the sense that the next movement would not be a sudden drama, but the slow, inevitable unwrapping of the sequence that had been perceived and carefully held. There was no accusation. There was something heavier, a poised pressure, like a coiled spring in the silence. As the evening deepened and shadows lengthened, the final gathering had done what Poirot intended. It had made everyone aware that the picture was no longer fragmentary. They understood, each in their own private way, that the curtain was about to be drawn back. The logic had been collected. The tensions had been redefined, and the time for the reveal, when the reconstruction would begin, was very near. Chapter 16. The reveal. The salon was quiet in that peculiar way. Silence settles when it is laden, not empty, but full of expectation. Each of those gathered felt the shift. The final gathering had set the stage, and now Poirot, having waited until the network of misdirection and pressure had stretched taut, began to speak with the cold precision of a surgeon exposing the wound beneath the skin. There would be no melodrama. The reveal, like everything else, would emerge from logic laid piece by piece until the only sensible conclusion remained, luminous and inevitable. He started, as was his custom, from the small, stubborn particulars. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, you have all been involved in the shaping of legacy. That shaping, when threatened, produces movement, some overt, some hidden. Lady Penelope Langley received a letter. The letter was not finished because the writer hesitated. That hesitation was not out of fear of exposure, but out of calculation of effect. The perfume was not mere decoration. It carried with it a substance, subtle, inhaled, that mimicked the very idea of a faint breath of something pleasant, and yet— He turned slightly, so his gaze caught Mrs. Evelyn Harcourt. It contained the means to stop a voice. He paused, letting that settle, then continued. Lady Penelope had discovered something. She had used her gloves to handle it secretly. She had removed them to touch it, then replaced them to preserve her appearance. That small nick in the glove, made by a fine instrument, was not a careless accident. She had opened a compartment in her study, one that had been used recently to hide documents. She found evidence that what had been presented to her as old promises and comfortable adjustments had deeper strings pulled by manipulation. She sensed that the legacy she had trusted was being redirected, that those promises had been used to control and to hide the redirection of memory and influence. She sought proof. She found the hidden panel. She learned of an altered codicil, one that would have given certain memorial weight and control to those who wished to steer the story without her knowledge. She confronted the one who had orchestrated the soft pressure, the planted doubt, the careful redirection. His gaze, unblinking, settled now fully on Mrs. Harcourt. It was you, madame, who feared the exposure of that manipulation. You feared that Lady Penelope, having seen the panel and understood the control being exerted, through promises and the soft cushioning of suggestion, would unravel the careful story you had constructed with Sir Edmund's cooperation. You had friends, influence, the language of memory. You knew how to make a watcher doubt. You placed the phrase into Lydia's awareness through a soft suggestion whispered perhaps in casual confidences or through those around you, so that the watcher would feel unsure of what she had seen. You used Sir Edmund, whose own grants and expectations had grown tangled with Lady Penelope's shifting terms, to repeat that phrase in the manner of an unintentional cushion, making her look inward and away from your hand. She did not tremble. Her face was composed, but the composure had a slight fissure, an awareness that the weave was now being unraveled. "Monsieur Poirot," she said coolly, "you speak of influence as if it were crime. I only sought to preserve what was good." "You preserved, yes," Poirot answered, "but you did more. When you saw that Lady Penelope had slipped beyond the cushion, when she began to see the edges of your direction, you acted to stop her. The letter was prepared with that perfume, madame. It was not sent in anger, but in calculation. The perfume held a faint volatile, a toxin that, when inhaled in the small private space of her inner salon, would not leave marks, would not cause an immediate flurry, but would still take the breath, producing sudden collapse. You did not wish scandal that would point directly to you. You wished her silence, quiet, dignified, as if death were a natural closing. The hesitation in the letter's writing was deliberate. It invited her attention. It was placed where she would see it, so she would act. You knew she would handle what she found. You feared that she would expose the alteration. You gave her a whisper and a poison. Mrs. Harcourt's eyes flicked briefly to Sir Edmund, whose own expression had gone pale. Not from guilt of the murder, but from the recognition that he had been a pawn in a larger sequence he had only half understood. "You involved me," he said, "only insofar as I was unaware of any deadly intent." "You were useful," Poirot said almost gently. "You repeated a phrase offered to you, softening Lydia's certainty, without realizing it was a diversion. That diversion gave Madame the space to press, to adjust, to prepare. You were not the poisoner. You were the cushion. That is why your slip about the watcher's warning was so revealing. It was language given to you to protect the one who arranged the weight behind it." Lydia, who had stood quiet and watchful, now stepped slightly forward. Eyes on Mrs. Harcourt. "She was here," Lydia said, her voice steady. "She came to me once in the afternoon to calm my concerns." She offered reassurance, and in the same breath suggested that I might be reading too much into small things. She used phrases like, "Comfort hides things," and asked if I could trust my own notes. I thought then it was, "Please advice." I did not know. "Oui," Poirot said. "That is the way. The one who wished to silence observation does not take it away by force." She places a soft question over it, a doubt, a reinterpretation. Then, as the watcher withdraws, she acts elsewhere. "You, Lydia, were to be made uncertain, so that you would not press when she felt the contraction. It was not enough. You saw the hidden. That is why she had to act more directly." He turned at last to Miss Charlotte Wentworth. "You, mademoiselle, were the bright first flag. Your questions threatened the structure, and so you were framed by the appearance of your own pursuit. That too was, in part, useful. It distracted while another movement was made." "You are saying," Charlotte whispered, "that I was a foil." "A necessary one," Poirot conceded. "You asked questions. That drew eyes. She counted on that. She had the glove's small nick explained away as Lady Penelope's curiosity. She did not expect that the one she thought to quiet would piece together the panel, nor that the watcher would withstand her soft pressure. She miscalculated. Mrs. Vabrois, Harcourt's lips tightened. "And the codicil." "You would have used the memorial," Poirot said, "to reframe the story publicly. That is why you built comfort around it. Promises, quiet endorsements, and the soft language of memory. Lady Penelope, in discovering the hidden manipulation, threatened to make the story visible. That is why she had to be silenced. Not for scandal. No, for quiet cessation. She believed she could do it without ruin, with the elegance of an unspoken death. Silence, then. Settled, heavy, precise. Mrs. Harcourt's mask slipped marginally, as if the logic had become too tight within the air for her to make a graceful retort. Poirot let the stillness do the work of the accusation's completion. He did not shout it. He had already placed the pieces so that each listener understood, even if not all admitted it to themselves. "You will not leave this room," Poirot said finally to Mrs. Harcourt. "Inspector, the method of delivery must be examined. The perfume? The sample from the letter will show the exact compound. The hidden panel will be opened fully, and the codicil retrieved. The question of motive lies there. The question of opportunity is lodged in the quiet conversation and in the small planned pressure placed on the watcher." Mrs. Harcourt's composure broke fractionally. "Just enough." "You have no proof," she murmured softly. "Proof," Poirot replied, "comes after the truth reveals itself. You have given us the story. Now we will see if your details hold." Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. For a moment, after Poirot's calm yet devastating unraveling, the room held its breath. The pieces had been placed with such quiet inevitability that resistance seemed both natural and futile. Mrs. Evelyn Harcourt, whose composure had held like polished silver, now showed the first clear crack. Her eyes darted once, to Sir Edmund, to Lord Granville, to the small, watchful Lydia, and then fixed on Poirot. There was no dramatic collapse. Instead, a refined face went pale in the way a fine painting fades when exposed to light too long. Slowly, inexorably, revealing what was beneath. "You have arranged your suspicion as if it were evidence," she said, her voice cool, but the edges trembling just enough to betray the internal calculation already mutating into desperation. "You speak of intention, you speak of influence. You have taken the fact that I worried about reputation and turned it into guilt." "It is not worry that is the problem, madame," Poirot replied gently. "It is the arrangement of worry into action that seeks to control. You saw a story changing and thought the author should not be permitted to finish it. You used language like a velvet glove over a fist. You made the watcher doubt so she would not see. You used the gentleman who gave so much to cushion the pressure with soft phrases. Then, when the possibility of exposure became real, you arranged the silence to be painless. I did what was necessary, she said. And in the necessary was the small, thin plea of someone who believed herself justified. Lady Penelope was destabilizing the work we had built. She would have dismantled legacies under the guise of honesty. I only sought to prevent damage. She was to be stopped, quietly. No scandal, no ruin. A natural end, as one might say. A natural end that required design, Poirot observed. You placed the letter. You prepared the perfume. You knew its effect would be subtle, to avoid visible violence. You knew it would mimic the gentle collapse of breath and leave no wound. You counted on her being careful, on her using her gloves to investigate, on her finding the hidden place too late. You did not count on the watcher seeing beyond the softened misdirection, nor on Miss Wentworth's questions drawing enough attention to force your adjustments too soon. She looked briefly at Sir Edmund, who had gone slack, as if realizing he had been more involved in the ripple than the source. You involve him again, she said, with a sharpness that tried to shift the weight. He was my ally in ensuring continuity, not in murder. He was the cushion that made your suggestion less visible, Poirot replied. He was not the poisoner. That is a difference. The difference is the truth. You asked for quiet cessation because you believed it would not be seen. The truth, however, has its own gravity. She stood then. Her graceful posture, once carefully arranged to absorb scrutiny, now became a movement of someone attempting to take control of what was happening, not with force, but with the appearance of dignity. I will leave, she declared, voice rising slightly, the first overt action of defiance since the reveal began. I will not be dragged through gossip and rumor over what could have been a reform. Inspector Mallory moved as if in reflex, but Poirot's small hand, lifted delicately, stayed him. Let her speak, Poirot murmured. The one who believes herself above consequence will try a last turn. The attempt will show her desperation more than her words. Mrs. Harcourt stepped toward the door with that measured gait she had used in salons for years, used to having things concede to her presence. Lord Granville, without overt movement, leaned slightly forward. Sir Edmund's face was ashen. Lydia watched, hands unclenched but ready. She reached the threshold, and for a moment it appeared she might cross it, that quiet escape from a room that now held the truth like a net around her. Then, with a swift grace, as if compelled by a second thought, she turned back. Her hand, almost imperceptibly, moved to the small brooch at her throat. A gift, it was said, from a long-ago benefactor, one she had worn every day as an emblem of cause. She pressed it, and a faint, soft click sounded. A compartment in the brooch opened, revealing a tiny folded note. She held it out, an offering, perhaps a last bargaining chip, perhaps a confession shaped as explanation. It was not only the legacy, she said, voice thinner. She would have exposed others. They would have been undone. I saved them. I saved their stories. You saved their stories by ending hers, Poirot said quietly. The note is a small thing. It contains what you feared most, that she saw how interests had been layered and manipulated, and that the memorial was not a tribute, but a consolidation of influence hidden as tribute. She let the note drop, and the inspector picked it up with the same deliberate care that had guided him through the earlier phases. Inside were names, dates, financial allocations dressed in the language of benevolence. Not a confession, but the proof of the manipulation she had feared being revealed. The codicil, hidden by Lady Penelope, had been rewritten under the guise of minor changes. The small pieces fit. The intended memorial would have, quietly, transferred public remembrance while softening the accountability of those who steered it. The true motive, then, was not merely preservation. It was control. You will not go anywhere, Poirot said, raising his voice just enough that it ceased to be gentle. Inspector, I ask that Mrs. Evelyn Harcourt be held. Let her reflect on the difference between preserving and silencing. She will answer in due order for the letter, the perfume, and for the quiet arrangement that led to the death. She did not resist. The game, which had been one of suggestion, of redirection, had ended in a quiet collapse much like the one she had once engineered. There was no dramatic chase. The attempt to leave had been the moment of exposure. The justice, in this case, would be a matter of process, examination of the compounds, comparison of the letter's residue, retrieval of the altered codicil, and the establishment of pattern. Poirot ensured each small step was set. Sir Edmund, relieved of the immediate weight, yet aware of his own complicity in the soft cushioning, sank into his chair. Lord Granville stood, silent, as if recalibrating all the alliances he had once believed steady. Miss Wentworth's expression was unreadable. Relief, perhaps, or a quiet satisfaction that the screen had slipped. Lydia, who had been the watcher, now watched as the wheels began to turn toward consequence. Poirot, standing slightly apart, allowed the moment to settle. He did not gloat. He had taken the measure of human shape again and seen justice begin its slow, careful arc. The outcome had not been violent. It had been inevitable, collected by observation, pressure, and the soft, patient logic that was his signature. The story, which had been a tangle of motives and misdirection, was now, in this room, becoming a clear narrative, one that would soon be folded into the proper hands and closed with the weight of truth. Chapter 18. The closing remark. The hours that followed the quiet arrest were not ones of fanfare. There would be inquiries, examinations, and the slow turning of administrative wheels, chemical analysis of the perfume, the retrieval and authentication of the altered codicil, and the formal interviews that would place each piece of the narrative into official record. The immediate storm, however, had passed into a steady grey clarity. The salon, once a hive of layered tension, now held a subdued stillness, like a room after a performance when the audience lingers not from suspense but from reflection. Mrs. Evelyn Harcourt had been taken to a room nearby under gentle guard. She had spoken little, offering that same elegant defense about preservation and the dangers of unchecked change. The phrase "necessary design" had become a kind of mantra. Sir Edmund Harlow, who had been her quiet collaborator in shaping public perception, sat with an expression that blended relief and unease. He was, as Poirot had said, a cushion. He had softened the edges of suggestion without ever seeing the full weight of the blade behind it until it had been drawn. He sent Miss Charlotte a look, one that held apology and acquiescence, and she, with a faint nod, offered a tempered acceptance. Their alliance, strained and altered, would endure in different shape. The openness of truth had shifted their mutual understanding. Count Vasileff and Mr. Alistair Crane, having been implicated as those with influence over memory and legacy, retreated into their respective orbits with a new caution. The Count, whose talk of light and remembrance had provided a pivot in Poirot's thought, now entertained proposals with the older restraint of a man who had seen the influence of what is left unsaid. Crane, whose restless ambition had tilted toward adaptation, began to speak of other ventures, those less bound by the fragility of reputation. Lord Granville stood, quiet and thoughtful, at the edge of the gathering, having seen his carefully woven network fray and reknit itself around new, sharper knots. Miss Charlotte Wentworth, having been cleared of the earlier false implication, had the peculiar grace of a woman who had been used and then understood the necessity of recalibration. She had sought truth. In doing so, she had become a mirror reflecting the rougher intentions of others. She would continue with a quieter scrutiny in the realm of charitable oversight, wiser for the knowledge that behind the language of benevolence there can be structure bending the light. Lydia Penn, who had begun as the watcher made to doubt, now stood in a different place. The notebook, recovered and validated, had become a chronicle not only of observation, but of resilience. Her young voice, which had once trembled at the suggestion that her perception might be unreliable, now carried the calm of someone who had seen and endured. Poirot had advised her, in the stillness after the reveal, to keep writing, not only what she saw, but what she felt. For the small grey cells of others might be clever, but there is clarity in honest witness that no amount of suggestion can fully obscure. The codicil, examined, showed the subtle redactions and insertions, changes that would have, over time, shifted public remembrance in a way that made dissent invisible. Lady Penelope had found the manipulation not merely as a threat to her philanthropic intentions, but as a distortion of truth. That was what had driven her to the quiet examination in her own study, what had led to the secret handling with gloves, and ultimately the slow, gentle end fashioned to look natural. The evidence, once brought into alignment, showed a woman who had acted in the last hours not as victim, but as guardian, uncovering a story that others had been constructing for their own permanence. I watched Poirot in those later moments as he drifted near the fireplace, hands folded, small mustaches bristling with tranquility. He did not gloat. There was, instead, that soft sadness which comes when one has seen humanity in its full complexity, the ingenious, the fearful, the manipulative, and the quietly brave. He turned to me. "It is finished, Hastings," he said, not with triumph, but with that calm measure. "The truth, you see, is not always loud. It is often a series of soft adjustments that, when aligned, make the loudest sound, the quiet collapsing of deception." "And justice?" I asked. "Do you think it will be served the way Lady Penelope would have wished?" "Justice is a journey, mon ami," Poirot replied. "It must walk slowly on the straight path now revealed. Mrs. Harcourt will have her day to explain. Sir Edmund will be reminded how soft complicity bends one toward responsibility. The others will rearrange their lives with the knowledge that the little grey cells of observation are always near, even when not seen. Lydia will carry on. Miss Wentworth will continue to question. The memorial—" He paused, looking toward the window where the light had faded to a silvery dusk. "Will be built on truth, perhaps different from what was first planned. That is as it should be. Memory must remember accurately, or it becomes myth that serves the wrong masters." He sipped the tea. Now cool, that had been offered to him in the quiet aftermath. The perfume analysis would confirm the compound, the codicil would be restored to its rightful clarity, the altered intentions would be exposed. He had given all of them, a murderer, a manipulator, the misled and the witness, the chance to see themselves as part of a story that would end with accountability, but not cruelty. Poirot believed, with the deep certainty of the humane mind, that understanding was its own kind of mercy. As the others dispersed, some to speak with authorities, others to attempt to stitch continuity back into their lives, Poirot and I remained. He looked at the small slip of note Lydia had given him earlier, folded carefully, and then turned his face toward me. "You know, Hastings," he said, "the most interesting thing is that the one who tried to silence the Watcher did not understand that watching is a partnership. The Watcher sees, and the one who thinks to hide under comfort reveals themselves by trying to change what the Watcher believes. It is always the act of altering perception that gives the clever away. They believe themselves to be secret, when their attempt to conceal is the loudest thing of all." I nodded, and in the quiet, understood that the case, with its layers of misdirection and human frailty, had given us more than a solution. It had given a map of how ambition, fear, and loyalty intertwine, how even the best intentions can warp when pressed by the imperative to control, and how a small, steady observation, when not cowed by suggestion, can unravel the most carefully constructed deception. Poirot stood, smoothed his coat, and with his customary little bow to the room and to the unseen, prepared to depart. "We go, Hastings," he said. "There will be letters, there will be reports, but tonight the quiet will be enough. Let the little grey cells rest. They have done their work."